There is a saying among old spacers, passed down through 100 wars and whispered in 100 dying tongues. Never mistake silence for weakness, and never mistake a smile for surrender. The raiders of the Scarn Compact had never heard that saying. If they had, they might have chosen a different world to burn that day. The Academy sat on the edge of New Providence, a colony barely 3 decades old, ringed by wheat fields and solar farms, and the kind of quiet that only exists in places that have never known war. It was a school for pilots and engineers, mostly teenagers and young adults, training for careers in orbital logistics and colonial defense drills that nobody expected to ever actually use. The instructors were retired officers who taught more out of boredom than necessity. The students carried datapads instead of weapons. It was, by every metric the Scarn Scouts had gathered, the softest target in the sector. An easy raid. A collection of hostages, some salvage, maybe a few slaves to sell to the mining consortiums, out past the veil. No resistance, no risk. That was the intelligence report. That was the plan. That was the mistake. In the third row of a mid-morning tactical theory class sat a girl named Wren Calloway, 17 years old. Quiet, unremarkable, the kind of student teachers described in polite, forgettable terms. Attentive, cooperative, keeps to herself, quo. She wore her hair in a simple braid, kept her uniform pressed, and never spoke unless called on. Nobody at the academy knew her father had been a Void Ranger, one of the old special operations units disbanded after the cessation treaties, the peace agreements, that had supposedly ended humanity's need for soldiers like him. Nobody knew that when he died 3 years ago. The last thing he left her was not a house, or savings, or a letter. It was a blade. A short, curved combat knife, forged from a metal that did not exist anywhere in the colonial catalogs, humming faintly when you held it right, the kind of weapon issued only to operators who were trained to end fights before they started. She carried it now in a sheath strapped along her ribs, hidden beneath her uniform jacket, not because she expected to ever use it, but because it was the only piece of him she had left. She touched it sometimes without realizing. A habit, a comfort, a promise she'd made to herself the day they buried an empty casket, since there had been nothing left of him to bury at all. The academy thought she was just a girl still grieving her father. They had no idea what he had actually taught her in the years before the raid that took his life, in the quiet hours after school when he would take her out to the scrapyards on the edge of town and show her, patiently, relentlessly, the things his body still remembered even after the treaties told him to forget. The alarms went off at 10:42 in the morning. Mid-lecture, mid-sentence, the old instructor's voice cutting off as the ceiling lights flickered red, and a klaxon shrieked through the halls. Nobody in that classroom had ever heard a real alarm before. The drills were always announced beforehand, scheduled, gentle. This one was not. Wren's hand found the hilt of her knife before her mind had even finished processing the sound. Outside, the sky tore open with a shriek of atmospheric entry. 3 Raider transports screaming down through the clouds on plumes of black exhaust, their hulls scarred and unmarked, pirate ships flying no colors because they answered to no one. They came in low over the wheat fields, kicking up storms of dust and shredded grain, and they landed hard, ramps slamming down before the engines had even finished dying. The Scarn Raiders that poured out were tall, gray-skinned things, with too many joints in their limbs and mouths that opened wider than they should have, wearing scavenged armor, plated with trophies from a dozen other massacres. They moved like they owned the world, already laughing in their clicking, guttural language. Weapons slung low and lazy, because why would you need to be careful storming a school full of children? The first door they kicked in was the tactical theory classroom. The screaming started immediately. Students scrambled from their seats, chairs clattering to the floor, the old instructor throwing himself in front of the door with nothing but a stylus in his hand. Which one of the raiders swatted him down with a single backhanded blow that sent him sprawling unconscious against the wall? The raiders fanned out into the room, 3 of them, weapons raised, scanning the huddled, terrified students, with the bored efficiency of men doing a job they'd done 100 times before. And in the middle of all that chaos, one student did not scream, One student did not run. Ren rose from her chair, slow, deliberate, the same way her father used to rise from a crouch before a strike, and the raider's eyes swung toward her because stillness in a room full of panic draws attention like a flare in the dark. She smiled. It was not a smile of fear, disguised as calm. It was not the brittle grin of someone about to break. It was the small, quiet smile of someone who had spent 3 years waiting, without even realizing it for a moment. Exactly like this one. The lead raider barked something in his clicking language, gesturing with his weapon for her to sit back down, to comply, to be the soft and harmless thing his intelligence reports had promised him she would be. Ren reached into her jacket instead and drew her father's blade. The metal caught the emergency lighting and threw it back in a thin red line, and for just a moment, the raiders actually laughed. A child drawing a knife. Against plasma rifles, it was almost funny to them. Almost cute. Almost cute. One of them said something to the others and they chuckled in that awful clicking way, weapons lowering just slightly, because clearly this was not a threat worth taking seriously. That was their first mistake. Ren's father used to tell her that the most dangerous moment in any fight is the half-second after your enemy decides you're not dangerous at all. That's the door. That's the only door you get. Walk through it before it closes. She walked through it. She crossed the distance to the nearest raider faster than his eyes could track, blade flashing, up and across in a motion so economical, it barely looked like violence at all, more like a dancer's gesture, and the raider's weapon arm fell to the classroom floor, still holding the rifle before he even understood what had happened to him. His scream came late, arriving after the pain already had, and Ren was already moving past him, already inside the guard of the second raider, driving the blade up beneath his jaw with the flat professional economy of someone who had been trained not to fight, but to end fights permanently in the fewest possible motions. The third raider finally raised his weapon, finally understood on some animal level that something had gone catastrophically wrong, and Ren was already there, inside his reach, one hand clamping his wrist and redirecting the barrel toward the ceiling as the other drove the knife home between the plates of his armor where her father had taught her the seams. Always were, no matter whose armor it was, because armorers the galaxy over always made the same mistakes in the same places. 3 raiders, 4 seconds. The classroom went from screaming chaos to stunned, ringing silence. Ren stood in the middle of the wreckage, breathing steady, blade dripping, and looked at her classmates crouched behind overturned desks with wide, disbelieving eyes. "Stay down," she said, her voice quiet, almost gentle. "This isn't over yet." Outside in the corridor, more raiders were pouring through the breached main doors, moving in loose, confident squads toward the dormitory wing, where the youngest students, some barely 14, were being herded by their instructors into a supply closet that everyone already knew wouldn't hold against a plasma rifle for more than a few seconds. Ren moved toward the sound of it, stepping over the bodies of the raiders she just killed, and something in her chest had gone very cold and very clear, the way her father used to describe the moment right before combat became something like meditation. She wasn't thinking about fear anymore. She wasn't thinking about the fact that she was 17, or that she had never actually killed anyone before that morning, or that some distant part of her would probably need to sit down and cry about all of this later, once it was over. Right now, there was only the corridor, and the raiders in it, and the children behind them who had no one else standing between them and slaughter. She rounded the corner into the main hallway just as a squad of 6 raiders was forcing the supply closet door, and one of the younger students, a boy no older than 13, was dragged out by his collar, screaming, kicking, utterly helpless against the alien's grip. Something in Ren's mind went very quiet and very final. "Let him go," she said, and her voice carried down that corridor, with a weight that made even the raiders pause, because there was something wrong about how calm it was, how utterly devoid of the terror they expected from prey. The lead raider, a broad-shouldered brute with a jagged scar across his throat plate, turned toward her and barked out something that the Academy's translation implants rendered, imperfectly, as a question and an insult rolled into one. "What is a child doing with a blade?" Ren tilted her head slightly, the way her father used to when he was about to make a point he considered self-evident. "I'm not the child you should be worried about," she said. "I'm the consequence you didn't plan for." The raider laughed and gestured for two of his men to deal with her while the others finished securing the hostages, clearly still unable or unwilling to update his assessment of the threat in front of him, because pride is a slow learner, even when the evidence is already writing itself in blood on the floor behind you. The two raiders sent toward her raised their weapons, and Wren did the thing her father drilled into her 1,000 times in the scrapyard behind their house, the thing he called closing the gap, the single hardest skill to learn and the single most important one, because a blade is useless at range, and a gun is nearly useless up close. And the entire art of what he taught her was making sure she was never, ever at range. When the shooting started, she was already moving before their fingers found the triggers. She ducked low under the first shot, close enough to feel the heat of the plasma bolt scorch past her shoulder, and drove upward into the first raider's chest, with the blade angled to slip between the segmented plates there, twisting it free in the same motion she used to spin behind him, using his falling body as cover from the second raider's line of fire. The second raider hesitated, just for a heartbeat, unwilling to shoot through his falling comrade, and that heartbeat was the only gift Wren needed. She was on him before he adjusted his aim, blade opening a line across the inside of his wrist that made his weapon clatter uselessly to the floor, and she finished it the way her father always insisted she finish everything, quickly, cleanly, without hesitation, because hesitation was the thing that got good people killed in bad situations. 4 raiders down, the boy, who'd been dragged from the closet, scrambled backward, staring at her with an expression that mixed terror and awe in equal measure, and Wren spared him half a second of eye contact. "Go back inside," she told him. "Lock the door. I've got this." The remaining raiders in the corridor, 3 of them, finally seemed to understand that something had gone deeply fundamentally wrong with their raid, and the lead raider's mandibles clicked in what might have been the alien equivalent of alarm as he raised his weapon and shouted an order into his comm. More footsteps thundered from the far end of the hallway. Reinforcements. Wren allowed herself for just a moment a small flicker of something that wasn't quite fear but was adjacent to it. An acknowledgement that this was the part her father always warned her about, the point in a fight where the numbers stop being manageable through skill alone and start requiring the environment to become a weapon too. She glanced up at the corridor's emergency systems, the fire suppression conduits running along the ceiling. And she remembered something else her father used to say: the academy isn't just a building. It's a battlefield if you make it one. She sprinted toward the environmental control panel, bolted to the wall near the science wing, the lead raider's shot scorching a black line into the wall inches from her head, and she slapped her palm against the manual override just as the reinforcements rounded the corner behind her in a solid wall of gray-skinned muscle and weaponry. The corridor's fire suppression system activated, flooding the hallway with a dense chemical fog designed to smother flames and, incidentally, blind anything relying primarily on optical sensors that weren't built for a human school's low-grade industrial fire retardant. The raiders, whose vision apparently skewed heavily toward infrared and motion tracking in open environments, suddenly found themselves stumbling through a hallway that had become an impenetrable soup of chemical haze and confused heat signatures. But Wren, who had grown up in a house where her father ran blackout drills for fun on lazy Sunday afternoons, moved through that fog like she'd been born in it. She heard, rather than saw, the nearest raider's confused, shuffling steps, and closed the distance in 3 silent strides, her blade finding the gap in his armor by memory and muscle rather than sight. He went down without even understanding what killed him. The one beside him spun wildly, firing blind into the fog, plasma bolts scorching craters into the walls and ceiling, and Wren let him waste his charge cycles for 3 full seconds before ending his confusion permanently. By the time the fog began to clear, 6 more raiders lay motionless on the corridor floor, and the lead raider, the broad-shouldered brute who'd first laughed at her, stood alone at the end of the hallway, breathing hard, his weapon trembling slightly in his grip as he stared at the sole survivor of his squad. "What are you?" he demanded, his translator crackling with static and something that might have been genuine fear now bleeding into his voice. Wren wiped her blade almost absent-mindedly against her sleeve and looked at him with an expression that had nothing cruel in it at all, which somehow made it worse. "I'm the reason your intelligence reports are about to get updated," she said. assuming any of you live long enough to file one?" He fired first, out of panic, more than tactics, and Ren was already sidestepping, already inside his guard, already ending it the way her father had drilled into her 1,000 times, over 1,000 quiet evenings. That she had once resented for stealing her weekends, and now understood, with sudden and overwhelming clarity, had been the only inheritance that actually mattered. The corridor went silent again. She stood alone amid the wreckage of an entire raiding squad, breathing hard, blade hanging loose in her grip, and for just a moment allowed herself to feel the shake that had been building in her hands, the entire time the adrenaline finally catching up to the calm her training had imposed over it. Then she heard the screaming from the main atrium, and the shaking stopped because there was still work to do. The atrium was where the raiders had gathered the bulk of their hostages, nearly 40 students and 3 instructors herded into a huddled mass in the center of the open courtyard, ringed by a dozen armed raiders, while their commander, a taller, more elaborately armored figure with insignia denoting some kind of raid captain status, surveyed the scene with the satisfied posture of someone counting profit margins rather than human lives. Ren paused at the edge of the atrium, taking in the scene with the same cold clarity her father had once used to describe hostage situations during the rare, careful conversations he'd allowed himself about his old work. Too many hostages. No clean angle. This wasn't a fight to charge into, this was a fight to solve. She noted the emergency exits along the atrium's east wall, the load-bearing structure of the overhead lighting rig that the raiders hadn't bothered to account for, and the captain's own posture, arrogant, exposed, utterly convinced that nothing on this soft little colony world could possibly threaten him. She stepped out from the corridor shadows into the captain's line of sight, blade still in hand, and the entire atrium seemed to hold its breath. The captain turned toward her slowly, taking in her blood-stained uniform, the weapon in her grip, and the utter absence of fear on her face, and something in his posture shifted from arrogance toward the first flickers of genuine unease. "You," he said, his translator rendering the word with cold precision. "You are the one my squads report losing contact with." "I am," Ren confirmed, "one human girl." "One human girl," she agreed, and something in the flatness of her voice made several of the surrounding raiders shift their weapons slightly, uncertain, watching her the way prey watches something that has stopped behaving like prey at all. The captain laughed, though it came out thinner than his earlier confidence would have produced, and gestured toward the huddled hostages with his weapon. "Drop your blade," he said, "or I start removing pieces of your classmates. Until you do." Ren's expression did not change, but something behind her eyes went very still and very cold, the same stillness her father used to describe as the last thing certain people ever saw. "You're not going to do that," she said quietly. "And why is that?" "Because the moment you do," Ren said, "you lose the only leverage keeping me from doing to you exactly what I did to the 11 men you sent down that corridor." The captain's mandibles clicked rapidly, an alien tell that Ren recognized instantly as calculation turning into doubt, doubt turning, slowly, into something closer to fear. 11, he repeated. 11, she confirmed. "You're welcome to check the corridor behind me if you don't believe me, though I'd hurry. The fog's probably cleared by now, and it's not a pleasant thing to look at." A ripple of uncertainty passed through the raider ranks, weapons wavering slightly, eyes flicking toward their captain for guidance he clearly did not have ready to give. This was the moment Ren's father always talked about. The moment the enemy's confidence cracks, just slightly, just enough to create the opening you need. She moved. The captain's reaction was a half-second too slow, his weapon rising just as Ren closed the final distance between them, and she used his own bulk as cover from his squad's line of fire, the exact way she'd used the falling raider in the corridor earlier, driving her blade up under his jaw with a motion so fast and so final that several of the surrounding raiders didn't even register what had happened until their captain's body was already collapsing to the atrium floor. The chaos that erupted afterward was immediate and total. Some raiders opened fire, blindly striking their own comrades in the confusion. Others broke formation entirely, turning to flee toward the breached main doors, rather than face whatever the captain had just faced. A few, braver or stupider than the rest, tried to press the attack and found Ren already moving among them with the terrible, efficient calm of someone who had stopped counting the cost of what she was doing and started simply doing what needed to be done. The hostages scattered toward the exits the moment the raiders' formation broke. Instructors herding students toward the corridors Ren had already cleared, and within 90 seconds of the captain's death, the atrium held only Ren and the handful of raiders too stubborn or too trapped to run. She dealt with them methodically, without cruelty and without hesitation, the way her father had always insisted violence should be handled when it was necessary at all. Quick, clean, final. Not because she enjoyed it, but because prolonging it would only mean more risk to the people still hiding in the halls behind her. When the last raider fell, the atrium went silent, except for the distant wail of the Academy's alarm system and the ragged sound of Ren's own breathing. She stood alone in the wreckage of the raid, blade hanging loose at her side, and for the first time since the alarms had sounded, allowed herself to simply feel the weight of everything that had just happened. Her hands were shaking again. Her legs felt unsteady beneath her. Somewhere in the back of her mind, a small, quiet voice that sounded uncomfortably like her father's was telling her it was all right to feel that shake now that the fight was over, that she had done exactly what needed to be done, and nothing more. She sank down onto the edge of an overturned bench, blade resting across her knees, and breathed. It was nearly 20 minutes before the Colonial Defense Fleet arrived, alerted by the automated distress beacon the Academy systems had triggered the moment the raiders breached the main doors. By then, the remaining raider transports had already lifted off in a panicked, disorganized retreat, their captain dead and their raiding force gutted by a single 17-year-old girl who the intelligence reports had assumed would offer no resistance at all. The Defense Fleet commander, a weathered woman named Colonel Reyes, who had served in 3 separate border conflicts before taking the relatively quiet post overseeing New Providence's colonial security, walked through the Academy's wrecked corridors with a growing sense of disbelief that only deepened the further she went. 11 bodies in the East Corridor, a raid captain dead in the atrium, along with most of his personal guard. Not a single student casualty, not one. She found Ren still sitting on that overturned bench, blade cleaned and sheathed once more, being fussed over by 2 instructors who clearly had no idea what to make of the girl who had apparently, single-handedly, stopped a raid that should have overwhelmed the entire Academy in minutes. Colonel Reyes crouched down in front of her, studying her carefully. "You're Ren Calloway," she said. It wasn't a question. "Daughter of Marcus Calloway." Ren looked up, surprised. "You knew my father?" "I served under him," Reyes said quietly. "Before the treaties disbanded the Rangers, I was there the day we got word he didn't make it back from the mission that killed him." She paused, studying the girl in front of her with something between grief and awe. "He talked about you, you know. Said he was teaching you things. Said he hoped you'd never need to use any of it." Ren's jaw tightened, and for just a moment the calm mask she'd worn through the entire ordeal cracked, just slightly. Just enough to show the exhausted, grieving teenager underneath it. "I didn't want to need it," she said quietly. "But they were going to hurt those kids." Colonel Reyes was quiet for a long moment, looking at this girl, who had just done alone what should have required an entire trained response team, and felt something settle in her chest that she hadn't expected to feel that morning. Something like hope, tangled up with grief, tangled up with a fierce and sudden protectiveness. "Your father," she said finally, "would be very, very proud of you." Ren's eyes went bright, and she looked away quickly, blinking hard, and Reyes had the good grace to let the moment pass without comment. The story of what happened at New Providence Academy spread through the colonial network within hours, and then through the wider systems within days, the way stories about impossible things always do. A raid force of nearly 40 Scarn raiders, 3 transport ships, 1 experienced raid captain, entirely neutralized by a single 17-year-old human student, armed with nothing but a combat knife, and the training her father had left her. The Scarn Compact, when word eventually reached their command structure, reclassified New Providence from a soft target to an unknown risk, and quietly removed the entire sector from their raiding schedules altogether. Whatever intelligence had labeled human colonial schools as easy prey was thoroughly, permanently discredited. Colonial Defense Command opened an inquiry, not to punish Wren, but to understand her, and in doing so, uncovered the broader truth that had gone unspoken for years, that the cessation treaties which disbanded units like the Void Rangers had never actually erased the skills those soldiers carried. They had simply gone quiet, passed down in kitchens and scrapyards and quiet Sunday afternoons between fathers and daughters who never expected the world to ask for that inheritance to be spent. Wren was offered a formal commission in the reconstituted Colonial Defense Forces, an offer she considered for nearly a month before finally accepting, not out of ambition but because somewhere in the wreckage of that raid she had found something she hadn't expected to find: purpose. A place where the thing her father had given her, the thing she'd carried as grief for 3 long years, could finally become something else. A gift. A legacy, put to use in the way he'd always hoped it wouldn't have to be, but had trained her for anyway, because he understood better than anyone that hope was not the same thing as preparation. The academy itself was rebuilt within the year, its training curriculum, quietly, permanently altered. Basic self-defense courses became mandatory. A small, unassuming plaque was mounted near the atrium doors, engraved with 11 names that most visitors never asked about, and one line beneath them that Wren herself had requested be added, simple and unadorned. They came expecting nothing. They found everything. On quiet evenings, when the Defense Forces gave her leave, Wren would return to that scrapyard behind her old house, blade in hand, running through the same drills her father had taught her years ago, not out of grim necessity anymore, but out of something gentler. Memory, gratitude, the strange, complicated love of a daughter for a father who had given her the one thing that ultimately saved not just her own life, but the lives of nearly 40 children who would otherwise have become cargo in some raider's hold. She still carried grief. It never fully left, and she never expected it to. But it had changed shape over the months since the raid, softened at the edges, transformed from a hollow ache into something closer to fuel. Her father was gone, but the thing he'd built in her, patiently, quietly, across years of afternoons she had once resented, had become the exact thing that let her stand in a corridor full of monsters and walk out the other side with everyone behind her still breathing. The raiders who survived that day carried a very different memory of New Providence, one that spread quietly through pirate networks and mercenary channels across the sector, a cautionary tale whispered before other raids were planned. Check twice before you call a target soft. Somewhere behind those quiet doors might be someone who smiles right before she ends you. Wren never sought out that reputation. She never wanted to be a legend or a cautionary tale, or the subject of the quiet, odd glances she still caught from underclassmen in the academy's rebuilt halls. She simply wanted, in the end, what her father had always wanted for her: a life, a choice, the chance to decide for herself what she would become once the fighting was done. But she had learned something that day in the atrium, something she carried with her, long after the fog cleared and the alarm stopped and the transports lifted off into a sky that no longer looked quite so soft and quiet as it once had. Peace is not the absence of people who could fight. Peace is simply the space those people choose to protect, quietly, patiently, until the day it's threatened, and they rise and smile, and remind the world exactly why that peace was never actually as fragile as it looked. That was the lesson New Providence learned. That was the lesson the Raiders learned in the last few seconds most of them ever experienced. And that was the lesson Wren Calloway carried forward, blade at her side, into whatever future waited for a girl who had inherited, from a father she barely got to keep, the quiet, terrible, beautiful gift of knowing exactly how to protect the people. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to like the video and subscribe for more tales of unexpected heroes and the quiet strength hidden in the people the world too easily underestimates. Let me know in the comments what you thought of Wren's stand in that corridor, and which moment hit you hardest. There are more stories like this one coming, more tales of humanity's hidden depths, more reminders that the quietest person in the room is sometimes the most dangerous one too. Thank you for watching, and until next time, Keep your eyes on the stars and never underestimate the quiet ones.